Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is a J-Man Time, and today we're going to be doing part 2 of the Austro-Hungarian River Navy, or ships that made up the Austro-Hungarian River Navy that was largely based on the Danube River and the smaller rivers that made up the Austro-Hungarian River Basin, like the Tisza and the Drava rivers, for example. Now, in the last video, I covered the Austro-Hungarian heavy river monitors in the Sava class, and today we're going to be going over the Austro-Hungarian river patrol boats and river gunboats. These are the smaller classes of warships that served in the Austro-Hungarian Navy during the years of World War I between 1914 and 1918. And first, we're going to start off with the slightly larger, or technically smaller, if you're comparing them with the monitor class of ships. If you're comparing them to the Austro-Hungarian river monitors, the Austro-Hungarian river patrol boats. Keep in mind, we're going from the largest vessels to the smallest vessels. And the first class of vessel on the list is the Austrian Fogas class, also known as the Fogas class of armored river patrol boats that were constructed between 1915 and 1916. Now, the Fogas class consisted of two vessels, the SMS Fogas and her sister ship, the SMS Fogas, and they were constructed and entered service in 1915 and 1916. Both vessels weighed 60 tons, and they were powered by two vertical triple expansion steam engines with a maximum of 800 horsepower. They had a maximum speed of just 12 knots, and they had endurance of at least 150 to 300 nautical miles. The armor thickness was between 4 and 5 millimeters, so very thin when compared to the average Austro-Hungarian river monitor. The main armament of these gunboats were one 66 millimeter Skoda L30 K09 main gun, and they were also fitted with two 8mm Swarlos machine guns and rotating turrets. Each vessel had a crew of 27, and these vessels served all the way up until 1918, so only about 2 or 3 years between these two vessels. Now, these vessels were actually constructed in Budapest, Hungary, so these are technically Hungarian vessels. Now, during the First World War, they largely served on the Danube River, but would also traverse many of the smaller rivers, and they also participated in the invasion, or towards the end of the invasion of Serbia, which lasted from 1914 to 1915, and later on, they were involved in the conflicts with Russia and Romania, later on, also on the Danube River, as both Russia and Romania would join the Allied powers later on in 1914, and Romania later on in 1916. At the end of World War I, the SMS Fogas was transferred to Austria, while the SMS Suka was transferred to Hungary. In Austria, the Fogas kept her name, but got rid of the SMS moniker, while the Fogas was renamed the Hungarian patrol vessel Suffolk. Now, strangely enough, the Austrian patrol vessel Fogas was later sold to Hungary in 1927, where she was renamed Gödöllő, the Hungarian monitor Gödöllő. Now, in the year of 1929, both Austria and Hungary had a naval exchange in which they exchanged two of their existing gunboats for the other. The Hungarians had traded the Suka, also known in Hungary as the Suffolk, for the Austrian gunboat Barsch. The Barsch was from another class of ex-Austro-Hungarian gunboats serving in the post-war Austrian Navy. The Suffolk, or Suka, was later renamed the Bergo in the Austrian Navy and served in the Austrian Danube flotilla from 1929 until 1939. In March of 1938, Germany would annex Austria, and it would become part of Greater Germany, or Großdeutschland, and what was known as the Anschluss, or unification of Germany and Austria, in 1938. She was later taken over by the German/Austrian Kriegsmarine based on the Danube River, and would serve in the German-Austrian Navy from 1938 until 1939. In September of 1939, Germany would invade Poland, and this would begin the Second World War. During the first month of World War II, the Bergo served in the German Navy on the Danube. Later in October of 1939, she was decommissioned and sold for scrap. thus ending the history of the Fogas class armored gunboat Suka, or Sukas. Her sister ship Fogas, known as Gesella in the Hungarian Navy, would continue serving all the way up until the end of World War II, when she was later captured by Soviet forces when the Red Army captured the Hungarian section of the Danube River. She would survive during the Cold War, but was ultimately scrapped just like all other ex-Austro-Hungarian vessels serving in the post-war Hungarian Navy, both post-World War I and post-World War II, thus ending the history of the Fogas class of armored river gunboat/patrol boat from the Austro-Hungarian Navy and the post-war Austrian and Hungarian Danube flotillas. The next class of Austro-Hungarian river patrol boat was the Wels class of patrol boats that were constructed between 1915 and 1916, entering service in the same year of 1916. This class of patrol boat consisted of 4 vessels: the SMS Wels, the SMS Barsh, the SMS Campo, and the SMS Visa. All 3 vessels had a maximum displacement of 133 tons. Their main propulsion system were 2 AGE geared steam turbines. These are some of the first Austro-Hungarian vessels produced during World War I to use steam turbines, at least when it comes to vessels that were constructed for the Austro-Hungarian River Navy. These steam turbines had a maximum horsepower of 1,200 horsepower, and these vessels had a maximum speed of just 15 knots. They carried 18 tons of oil as their main fuel. The armor thickness of these vessels were between 5 and 8 millimeters, and their main armament was 2 66mm Skoda L26-K15 main guns, along with 8 8mm Swallows machine guns and rotating mounts. Their crew capacity was 27, and these vessels also served until the end of World War I in the Austro-Hungarian River Navy based in the Danube River. They also served in the Black Sea region as well during the Austrian and German advance into Russia between 1916 and 1918. Remember, Russia actually lost World War I on its front and lost a huge amount of territory. Pretty much all of the Eastern European countries that made up the Russian Empire were taken over by Germany and Hungary towards the end of the First World War. And this gave Austria and Germany access to the Black Sea, and some of these patrol boats even patrolled in the Black Sea region towards the end of World War I. After the defeat of Austria-Hungary in November of 1918, 2 of these vessels, the SMS Wels and SMS Barsh, were transferred to the Hungarian Navy, and they were still in service during the Second World War when Germany, Hungary, and Italy invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, where they were later either sunk or captured by Soviet forces at the end of World War II between 1944 and 1945. After World War II, they were later sold for scrap by the post-war era Hungarian Navy. Now, the SMS Campo and SMS Visa were renamed the Hungarian patrol vessels Szeged and Kecskemét in the Hungarian fleet. They served all the way until the end of World War II, where they were later captured by Soviet forces during the invasion of Hungary in 1944-1945. After World War II, these 2 vessels were eventually sold for scrap, thus ending the history of the Wels class of Austro-Hungarian river patrol vessels that served from 1915 to 1918, and later on from 1919 until 1945 towards the end of World War II in the post-war Hungarian Navy. The next class of patrol boat constructed for the Austro-Hungarian Navy were the Stöhr class of river patrol boats that were constructed in Budapest, Hungary between 1916 and 1918. These were some of the last vessels constructed towards the very end of World War I on the Austro-Hungarian front. This class consisted of 3 vessels: the SMS Stöhr, the SMS Laks, and the SMS R, as the final vessel was never completed and was only given the name R before being scrapped in 1919. All 3 vessels had a maximum displacement of 140 tons. They were powered by the same AGE geared steam turbines as the Wels class of patrol vessel. Their maximum horsepower was 1,400 horsepower, and they had a maximum speed of 16 knots. Their armor thickness was between 5 and 10 millimeters, so 2 millimeters more armor than the previous class, and they were armed with two 75mm Skoda L30-K16 main guns and 6 8mm Swalos machine guns. The unfinished R, or SMS-R, was to be armed with two 90mm Skoda L45-K6 main guns instead of the 75mm guns. But she was never finished, and she was sold for scrap in later on in 1919, in the post-war era. All three vessels had a maximum crew capacity of 42 sailors, and they served for just a few months, literally, in late 1918. These vessels entered service in August of 1918 during the last few months of World War I. So they saw very little service within the Austro-Hungarian River Navy. Most of their service life happened in Hungary, in Austria and Hungary. After World War I, the SMS Stöhr and SMS Lak ended up in the hands of the Austrian and Hungarian navies in the post-war era. SMS Stöhr was renamed the Hasani in the Austrian Navy, while the SMS Lak was later renamed Sopron in the Hungarian Navy. The Austrians later sold the SMS Stöhr, or the ex-SMS Stöhr, to Hungary in the year of 1927, where she was later renamed the Hungarian patrol boat Cormoran. Both vessels served in the Hungarian Navy until the Second World War, to the end of the Second World War. Now in 1930, the Cormoran was later renamed the Hungarian patrol boat Debrecen, and both Debrecen and Sopron served in the post-war Hungarian Navy throughout the Second World War. Throughout the interwar years and World War II, where they were later either destroyed or captured by Soviet forces between 1944 and 1945. The aforementioned SMS-R again was scrapped in 1919. And all of this combined pretty much ends the history of the Stöhr class of Austro-Hungarian armored river patrol vessels that entered service in 1918 towards the very end of World War I. Now let's go over the Austro-Hungarian river motorboats, or armored motorboats, that were constructed for the Austro-Hungarian Navy starting in 1906. And these vessels served until the end of the war in 1918. And the first class of vessel, or at least the first vessel on the list, is the B class of river patrol boat that was constructed in the year of 1906. This singular vessel was constructed in Gaines, Austria in 1906. Only one vessel was constructed, or one patrol boat was constructed for this class, and this singular vessel had a displacement of just 36.5 tons. She was powered by 4 Daimler diesel or petrol engines with a maximum horsepower of just 400 horsepower. Her speed was 14 knots, and she had an armor thickness of just 4 millimeters, so very light armor. Her main armament was 2 8mm Swalos machine guns, and she had a maximum crew of just 14. Now the vessel actually had a very short service life, entering service in 1906 and being discarded either after being damaged or simply being worn out by August of 1915, or the second year of World War I. She served during the first year of World War I during the invasion of Serbia, along with the rest of the Austro-Hungarian River Navy, but was decommissioned in August of 1915. Afterwards, she was either sold for scrap or she was converted into a civilian vessel, as there is no real history of what happened to her after the year of 1915. And that basically ends the history of the Austrian B-class of armored river patrol boat from 1906. Now this isn't the first class of patrol boat, but this was the first one, or the oldest one, still in service by the start of World War I in 1914. And then that brings us to the next class of a small armored patrol boat, and that is the Austrian E-class that were constructed between 1908 and 1910. Now this was a class of 4 vessels: the SMS E, the SMS F, the SMS G, the SMS G, and the SMS H. All vessels were constructed between 1908 and 1910, and they had a maximum displacement of just 15 tons, so pretty small when compared to the previous B class of armored patrol boat. They were powered by 3 Napier petrol engines. They had a maximum horsepower of just 350 horsepower. Their maximum speed was just 22 knots, much faster than pretty much most of the patrol boats in the Austro-Hungarian River Navy. And they had a maximum armor thickness of just 2 to 5 millimeters, so very light armor when compared to the heavier ships in the Austro-Hungarian River Navy. The main armament was 2 8mm Wels machine guns, and they had a crew of 7 each. Now the SMS F and SMS H were later transferred to the Austro-Hungarian Adriatic Fleet in 1917, where they were later surrendered to the Allies at the end of World War I in 1918. While the SMS G was later sunk in combat on September the 9th of 1914 during the Austro-Hungarian invasion of Serbia. Before World War I, in the year of 1913, the SMS E was later discarded and either sold for scrap or converted into a civilian vessel for some unknown reason. And that basically ends the history of the Austro-Hungarian E-class of armored river patrol boats constructed between 1908 and 1910 and serving until 1918. The next class of armored river patrol boat is the Austrian C-class riverboats that were constructed in the year of 1909. This class consists of 2 armored patrol boats that were constructed in Lustenau, Austria in the year of 1909, entering service in the same year of 1909. These vessels were known as the SMS C and SMS D, and these 2 vessels weighed 39 tons. They were powered by 2 petrol engines or petrol miniaturized turbines with a maximum horsepower of 600 horsepower. The vessels had a maximum speed of 14 knots and had an armor thickness of between 3 and 5 millimeters. Their main armament were 2 8mm Wels machine guns and revolving turrets or revolving mounts, and they had a crew of 12. Now these vessels were designed to operate both on the deep rivers like the Danube and shallower rivers like the Mur River. Now both vessels were lost in combat between September 1914 and May of 1915. On September the 9th, 1914, the SMS D was lost in combat against Serb forces along the Danube River during the early stages of the war in the Balkan region between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian forces. And later on, in May of 1915, SMSC was also lost in combat with Serb forces towards the end of the Serbian campaign in 1915, in which the Austro-Hungarian forces actually defeated the Serb army and occupied all of Serbia and neighboring Montenegro. So both vessels were sunk in combat during the first year and a half of World War I. Now, some of the components of these vessels were actually salvaged by the Serbs. One of the turrets, or the turret from the SMS D, was actually salvaged by the Serbs and later incorporated into Serbia's first warship, the Jadar. The Jadar was a Serbian armored gunboat that was built using components salvaged from sunken or badly damaged or captured Austro-Hungarian warships during the first year of World War I. So there you have it. At least some of this ship was still used or salvaged, and that pretty much ends the history of the C-class of armored river patrol boats that were constructed in 1909 and lost in combat between 1914 and 1915. The next class on the list, or you could say the next vessel on the list, as this is just one ship, is the Gesella class of armored patrol boat that was constructed in Lindsworth, Austria in 1914. Now this vessel here is a very small single vessel. Only one vessel was built, and it had a displacement of just 14 tons. It was powered by 2 petrol engines with a maximum horsepower of just 200 horsepower. The vessel had a maximum speed of just 14 knots. Its armor thickness was only 5 millimeters, and it was also armed with just 2 8mm Wels machine guns and rotating turrets. It had a maximum crew of 8, and this vessel actually managed to survive World War I, lasting well beyond 1918. Now, just like the previous class, this vessel was designed to operate both in the deep Danube River. It was specially designed to operate in the shallowest rivers and in the neighboring Balkan states or countries like Serbia. Now, in 1917, the SMS Gesella, she, just like most other Austro-Hungarian warships that were transferred to the Adriatic fleet based in the region of Trieste, were later captured by the Italians when Italy took over the Trieste region and the Austro-Hungarian section of the Adriatic, with some of the warships ending up in the post-war Yugoslav Navy once the state of Yugoslavia was formed in 1918 and 1919, thus ending the history of this class of gunboat. And that brings me to the last class of armored river patrol boat that was constructed by the Austrians, this time during the war, and that is the Lenz class, or Lensworth class, of a small armored river patrol boat that was constructed this time in 1915. Only one vessel was actually built, and this vessel, known as the SMS Lenz, had a displacement of just 27 tons. It too was powered by only 2 petrol engines, and had a maximum horsepower of just 220 horsepower. Its maximum speed was just 14 knots, and it had an armor thickness of between 5 and 10 millimeters. This vessel was actually fitted with a small turret-like structure that mounted its main armament, which was one 66mm Skoda L18 main gun, and it was also fitted with 3 8mm Swarlos machine guns. Its crew capacity was 8, and just like the SMS Gesella, she too managed to survive World War I well past the year of 1918 after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just like the Gesella class, she too was developed to operate both in the deep water Danube River and also some of these shallower rivers that existed both in Austria-Hungary and in the neighboring countries during the First World War. She, just like most other Austro-Hungarian warships that were transferred to the Adriatic fleet based in the region of Trieste, were later captured by the Italians when Italy took over the Trieste region and the Austro-Hungarian section of the Adriatic, with some of the warships ending up in the post-war Yugoslav Navy once the state of Yugoslavia was formed in 1918 and 1919, thus ending the history of this class of gunboat. And that is basically it. These were the purpose-built warships or small patrol boats, armored patrol boats, both medium and very light patrol vessels that were used by the Austro-Hungarian River patrol flotillas between 1914 and 1918 during the First World War. Most of these vessels are largely forgotten by history, but luckily their history was at least mentioned or maintained by the Austrians and Hungarians in the modern era, which is where I got all this information from. It comes directly from the Austrians and the Hungarians. But which of these vessels did you like the most? If you ask me, my favorite was the C class of river patrol boats, and the final class on the list, the SMS Lenz, or the Lenz class of armored patrol boats, as those vessels were pretty light, but were like miniaturized versions of the larger river patrol monitors like the SMS Bodrog that also served in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. But unlike those vessels, these vessels sadly did not make it into the 21st century, like the SMS Lita and SMS Bodrog, which still survive today as museum ships in Hungary and Serbia. So what do you all think of these? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off. And my next Austro-Hungarian video will most likely be on Austro-Hungarian submarines or Austro-Hungarian seaplane carrier and aircraft carrier projects of the First World War. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.